Hello, everyone. I thought I'd do one last video, try to keep this very brief. I noticed that I had a Kant key ideas video up before the Kant exam, and thought I'd do something similar for Mill. Just the key things. There's a much more comprehensive video that I sent out earlier this week, a Mill overview. But this is just key ideas. What is Mill looking for? He says in the beginning of the book. He's looking for a criterion of right and wrong. What is a criterion? It's a standard. Criterion is a standard or a reference. By which we judge. So another way of putting it is what is the first principle of morality, or what is the foundation of morality? These are all different ways of putting it, what is essentially the same idea. That idea of a criterion, though, is key, because a criterion would allow us to judge the morality of particular acts, to say with some confidence if the criterion is correct, whether the particular act is right or wrong. So it's quite obvious what he thinks the criterion of right and wrong, or the first principle of morality is. You could even say that he's looking for the greatest good. This is what moral philosophy has been doing since the time of the Greeks. He thinks he's found it, and he thinks that it's been around, floating around forever. It's just that people either have been hesitant to articulate it, come out and say it, or they have been unaware that they were in fact advocating it. But be that as it may, it's the principle of utility, or the greatest happiness principle. And that's the cornerstone of the book, and that's what he regards as the foundation of morality. Utility really has to be understood, and he goes to great pains to explain what he means by it. But utility means things are useful if they promote our welfare. Conducive? Geez, that's not how you spell conducive. Conducive to human happiness, promoting anything that promotes human welfare. And we are talking about human beings here. He doesn't include animals in his view of ethics. That's something that a lot of contemporary utilitarians would differ from him on. But here we're talking about a very anthropocentric form of ethical theory that really doesn't include, probably should, but doesn't really include animals. So the greatest happiness principle basically and by reverse of happiness, he's basically means unhappiness, of course. And that's the principle, that's the criterion. An action is right if, on the whole, it promotes happiness. It's wrong if, on the whole, it promotes the reverse of happiness. But of course, key to all this is that happiness is pleasure. Unhappiness is pain. So he's defined what he means by happiness and unhappiness. He simply means pleasure and pain. So a big part of chapter 2 is defending utilitarianism. sorry. Against the charge, sorry, that this is somehow demeaning to human nature to say that happiness is just pleasure, and basically to say that pleasure, therefore, if the only things he says, these things, pleasure and pain, basically, happiness and unpleasure, the happiness it's the only thing that's good in itself. It's the only thing that we always desire for its own sake, and therefore anything else is good insofar as it promotes it. Basically, that pleasure, happiness, and this is where utilitarianism is revealed as a hedonism, which is a term that you need to know. Any philosophy that says that pleasure is the good, or pleasure is the point of life, or the point of life is to experience as much enjoyment and pleasure as we can and avoid pain, is a form of hedonism, which is just the Greek word for pleasure. So he needs to, you know that in chapter 2, he defends himself against this charge for various reasons, and that's quite important. Basically, the range of human pleasures is greater than animals, that there are higher and lower pleasures, and that the higher pleasures are strictly human pleasures and are not degrading at all to human nature. We are not pigs. And the whole idea that it's better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied, better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied, really rests on the idea that we value the higher pleasures more than the lower pleasures, which he says are more intrinsically pleasurable, more desirable in themselves, the higher pleasures, and the proof of that is in the preference of those who've experienced both. So a large part of what he's trying to get at is that, that explanation of his own hedonism. Another thing that he really wants to emphasize is that it's not a selfish hedonism. Right? I should promote everyone's happiness, not just my own, right? That it's the greatest happiness principle, right? Not just my own happiness of the most people. Is basically the happiness of everyone involved. Trying to maximize that is what the key is. So it's not selfish. Another big issue is what he asks: what is the sanction of the greatest happiness principle? Basically, the greatest happiness principle, or what he calls the greater happiness morality, which essentially, to follow the principle, we find it requires that I do not privilege my own happiness. I maximize the general happiness. It does require a certain amount of altruism or self-sacrifice. So asking about the sanction of it is asking what gives the principle its authority, so that I might be willing to sacrifice my happiness for the happiness of others, if the principle calls for it, not for its own sake, right? That's the point. A very Kantian question, actually, and a very non-Kantian answer. There are external sanctions, basically public disapproval, the disapproval of others, the way that if you are totally selfish, that others will not deal with you, or that's an external sanction. An external sanction is like not committing a crime because you're afraid of being punished. Not being mean to somebody because you don't want them to be mean back to you. Right? Practical, prudential. But the internal sanction is, why would I follow it even if there were no external sanctions? Just basically, what makes me want to follow the greatest happiness principle or the greatest happiness morality. And the ultimate sanction for this is is a kind of subjective feeling, and that subjective feeling is the social feelings, caring for others, basically feeling bad if others suffer. Right? And so the ultimate, this is why it's such a non-Kantian answer, is that ultimately morality in its most essential point relies entirely on a subjective feeling, which is either there or it's not. One of the last big points that Mill hits on is whether the principle of utility can be proved. And I think the most important thing there for Mill is the question, of course, the answer to that question, of course, is no. And that's because no first principle can ever be proved. If something is the foundation and there's nothing below it, no, it just has to be assumed, which does not mean you can't argue for it. It just means you can't absolutely prove it. One of the points that Mill wants to make is that the principle of utility is, let's just say that it is harmonious with human nature. That is, it fits well into our lives, and we can argue that it's the most practical morality, or that it's the most natural morality that we could develop, but we can never actually prove the principle of utility. So these are just some of the key ideas that maybe I'll send out these notes, but this is just the basics, the basic structure, the most key central points, I think, in Mill. But it has to be fleshed out by, the further reading and maybe looking at the longer videos.